start with something new. A couple weeks ago, I went with my partner to go see the Broadway musical and Juliet in downtown Toronto. For those of you who aren't really familiar with it, it's a semi-meta rewrite of the end of William Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, where Juliet does not follow in Romeo's wake. I guess spoiler alert for that, and thus lives and experiences a very different life, taking her to Paris and all sorts of wacky shenanigans as her story is rewritten on the fly. And it's also a jukebox musical stuffed full of pop songs from the late 90s boy band era to, well, now. I'm stating for the record, I did not research the plot or style of the musical before going in. I didn't know what was coming. And if you could have seen my face when I clocked after the first song what this was gonna be, well, it certainly was something. Now, did I have a good time with it? Yeah, sure. The singing and performances were great. I can respect the dancing and costuming for feeling idiosyncratic without really having the greatest insight on how good it all was. It kind of fit together for me. Some of the song placements felt inspired. I certainly appreciated the lesser known but well-placed Backstreet Boys songs, as well as Robin Show Me Love, Kesha's Blow, and a perfectly timed Celine Dion pick. And I'll always appreciate when great pop music is celebrated for having more complicated or interesting writing than it got credit at the time, of which a lot of the Max Martin boy band era, it never really got that shine. It's not Shakespearean in the classical sense when it comes to the literary layers, but the interesting juxtaposition of the teenage melodrama of the tragedy of Romeo and Juliet. And for the record, I'm using the term melodrama as a descriptor of art that runs fundamentally on elevated emotional logic rather than something that is more muted or restrained or intellectual. There's absolutely a place for both. With these songs, made it all work surprisingly well, even if I was absolutely cringing at some of the picks, especially early on before I bought into the whole atmosphere, which flits between Renaissance Shakespeare, 1990s teen movies, and 2010s millennial self-aware earnestness. Very 2010s Disney for better and for worse. If I got a critique beyond the inclusion of every Katy Perry song they chose, and Can't Stop the Feeling by Justin Timberlake, it's most focused on the book. That's theater terminology for everything but the music and lyrics, in that it can be distinctly clever if you're reading between the lines, but you can also predict every note of the plot. Some characters feel thinly sketched or cliched. Every conveniently timed misunderstanding got a major eye roll out of me. The interweaving characters very involved in the metatext. By that I mean William Shakespeare himself and his wife can feel kind of forced, a little self-congratulatory, and the ending dodges its bigger swings, in my opinion, to its detriment. But is any of this surprising? No. The reviews of its Broadway run in 2022 echoed many of my critiques, especially around the relative shallowness. It's absolutely camp, but that's what the audience is here to see in a jukebox musical. Flashy costumes, broad performances, a ton of bombast, songs that everybody knows by the hook, if not the first couple of notes. They want to be entertained with what's considered the biggest and best if they make the expensive trip out to the big city and paid for Broadway or West End or Mervish tickets. They want to say that they saw a Broadway show, and unless they're a theater fan or a theater snob or a theater critic, and Juliet would likely give them the majority of what they want. And yeah, this video essay is about RAYE, and if you heard the album and saw the mixed critical reception, you know this ain't a review, and you already have an idea where this might be going. Let's start and ask a question that might seem kind of obvious on the surface, but has more layers than you might think. Why don't the majority of music critics talk about musicals? In fact, let's go deeper, as it can seem like there's a swath of music critics who have some level of distaste towards Broadway or mainstream musical iconography, And why is that? You rarely get these critics to admit the sound or genre just isn't their thing. They might have an alternative selection of musicals that they unironically enjoy. We'll come back to that. But it does tend to come out whenever they talk about specific acts, usually in pop music, that openly draw from sounds or aesthetics that owe a lot more to the stage, especially Broadway in its current incarnation. And this goes well beyond your usual poptimism for the record. You'll find more pop music fans than those who love musical theater. There is a bit of a divide there, where you begin to realize it's less about elevating the genre of pop as a whole, so much as securing critical and commercial attention for all their faves in comparison with, well, all those other people. And the fans of those other people, if you catch my drift. Now, a lot of answers I have to these questions, they're almost too obvious. The first being that musical theater is a very different entertainment medium than the album that critics normally talk about. The live performance, the inclusion of costuming, dance, the feeling of being in an enclosed space for all the spectacle, especially when theater performers might then break the fourth wall in real time and respond directly to the audience. I've talked about this myself back when I purposefully did not review Perfume Genius's 2022 album Ugly Season. Not because the project on record is bad, it's not. But it felt incomplete to me, minus some of that dance component, which has got its own artistic language and can impart new or different meaning. I just didn't feel fully equipped to talk about it well. Now, the other very obvious argument is one of practicality. I might live in Toronto, which got a wealth of great theater that can go underappreciated. Toronto has a bad habit of not appreciating the great things right in front of us until it's acclaimed everywhere else, while then celebrating some utter garbage. See the last 50 years of the Toronto Maple Leafs if you want a prime example. But if you're a critic who does not live in a major city, the scarcity in your own town or city alongside the expense of getting to a major hub to see it live, that's considerable. At least bands or artists can tour if you want that live experience, but you don't need it. And as the cost of that continue to skyrocket, experiencing the bands might be even harder. So if you're a music critic in a mid-sized city or a smaller town, or you live in the big city and can't exactly afford to see a new musical every other week when the tickets can easily run into the hundreds of dollars, if not more, and it's not like your schedule is slowing down, I get why you might skip out on reviewing the most recent musical, assuming there's an audience for it, even if it breaks containment and becomes more of a cultural moment. But pause for a moment. Because musicals, even independent of the film adaptations, which can be more popular, they can become cultural phenomena. It's rare, but it does still happen in the modern age. And yes, this is where I'm gonna have to talk about Hamilton. Full disclosure, I do like Hamilton. I've liked it since the mid-2010s, and I've heard all the critiques of it, from the well-founded arguments of historical revisionism to its extremely liberal politics for how it can Flanderize hip-hop to some of the truly deranged moments. I can say Thomas Jefferson, Miku Binder, and some of you just experienced war flashbacks. And sure, some of you know more about Hamilton thanks to the 2020 film stage show from Disney that became a thing that year because of, well, obvious reasons. But I was also a critic in the mid-2010s. I remember how it felt like, well, a broader cultural phenomenon, and the majority of people, they would not have seen it, but that's also because that same year, in September of 2015, we got the original cast recording of Hamilton, which runs over 2 hours of 46 songs and would wind up charting at number 11 on the 2010s Decade Billboard 200. That recording won a Grammy. It spawned a remix album in 2016 that's uneven as all hell, but also way better than it has any right to be. And I would know. I reviewed it 10 years ago. Multiple songs from it remain some of my favorites of that year. If I'm being brutally honest, if I remade my year-end songs and albums list in 2015, Hamilton would have had a serious shot of getting there. I mean, it would be me and Robert Christgau, go figure. But here's the thing. Music critics who primarily focus on the album, which, let's be the record, it's kind of like me, we didn't cover that cast recording in 2015. And we very well could have, So why? Well, this leads to a very thorny question, especially as I am a theater kid and probably could do more of this myself, but it's also where the music critic lens comes back, because the cast and compositions, they're often the best parts of those cast albums, because the production tends to suck. A lot. There's a reason why I've used musical theater production as damn near an insult, because for as many tremendously talented musicians might contribute to the score from the orchestra pit, they are rarely produced to sound as good as they can live. And that's assuming you can get and pay that orchestra and aren't operating off of some programmed backtrack with a budget somewhere below the surface of the planet, especially if they happen to get anywhere close to rock or mainstream pop or, God forbid, hip hop, where at best it sounds dated, at worst it's excruciating. And I'm not slamming the musicals for this directly. I'm really not, because their audience are musical fans. They're there for the singing cast, or the great script, or book, or cool vocal arrangements. They're likely not paying all that much attention who is playing on any given song or who's producing it. So you cut corners. For a brief tangent, one of the biggest divides between the theater kids who liked Glee and the fans of the acts that Glee was covering came down to, well, either the heresy of the song being included on the show, but often production as well. Glee songs were made on effectively an assembly line, and if they sounded kind of cheaply produced, it's because they were, and on average, I would give Glee the edge over a lot of Broadway cast recordings. I could even make the argument that some of the cheaper sounding recordings, they slip into the realm of just being pure camp, or at least be justified on some of that realm. Sure, the synths and guitars sound embarrassing, or that your orchestra might have 6 people on standby, but they're trying their best. They're trying to put on a show, and if it swings around to being so bad it's good, that's only a winner. And if this is true for Broadway, it's even more the case for off-Broadway cast recordings. If you know, you know. Hell, think about many of the musicals that became cultural phenomenon off of their cast recordings. Certainly not because people saw them as much live, and how much of it is because they are produced to sound like they could be played alongside the current mainstream. They sound bigger. Hamilton's a prime example. I'm guessing the reason that the hip-hop grooves are remotely credible is that alongside Broadway stalwarts, they had Questlove and Black Thought of The Roots as executive producers. I'm gonna say it, that matters. Same with Stephen Schwartz producing for Wicked. So let's put all this together. If you're a music critic, and assuming you got a passing interest in musicals at all, hi, you're probably not going to review the original cast recordings because A, you might feel like you're missing context that's better suited to the stage, and good luck getting the expensive tickets, especially if you want to be somewhat timely in getting your review out, and B, as a music critic, I'm gonna have to care about the music, the instrumentation, the production, and you're likely only going to get negative points in highlighting when it sounds like ass, because the audience either won't care as much, or they're going to swing around to justify it anyway, the whole so bad it's good argument. There's also a third reason, where you just might not vibe with the aesthetics of certain Broadway musicals or show tunes, or you might have more alternative taste when it comes to musicals that echo specific other artistic movements, be they experimental or just with a sound palette that doesn't ascribe to a lot of the classics. And I got kind of mixed opinions on this as a whole, because many of the musicals that tend to get cited within this alternative category or as cult classics, they often owe way more to the stage than they don't. A language that is more complex than just what you might think off of the golden age of Broadway, and which also ignores how the theatrical tradition has evolved on and off Broadway for decades, often kind of slipping around in parallel with the mainstream. But how well would you even learn that or be exposed to the alternatives if you're not closely in the loop? There is a knowledge gap there. But if you're looking for the arguments of practicality, there you go. And you know, the more listens I gave to RAYE's sophomore album, This Music May Contain Hope, the more I realized we have a very unique case study on display. Yeah, we're getting to the meat of it. RAYE is a classically trained musician and pop artist, but she is absolutely a theater girl, and her album might as well be for Broadway, or should I say West End, and it's a musical. warts and all. Where there was once a time that songs from musicals would actually hit the pop charts, and if you include Disney, that still kind of happens today, this is RAYE predominantly seeming to target the stage, with the album playing as more original cast recording. And as a longtime Marianas Trench fan, she's far from the first to do this. There are plenty of acts who have drawn on Broadway maximalism across the decade. See the 2010s and Panic at the Disco. The loaded question then comes on is, how much critics will buy in, presuming they recognize it?
Send a call out, calling all my baddest women, it's about to go down. Click, 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 clack, symphony, I need that. Click, 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 clack, symphony, I love the sound of it. You let the girls out. I did, darling. She's empowered by the sound of us marching. Her legs are hurting, but her back is still arching. And the sound reminds me that it's going to be alright.
Because I'll be real, I was very wary about the tone RAYE's debut, My 21st Century Blues, in 2023 took, and where she's only doubled down harder on it this time. It's camp, it's melodramatic to a fault, it swings for the fences, it's corny as hell, the humor and meta-humor are incredibly uneven, but RAYE's working her ass off to sell all of it. I was reminded very quickly of Juliet with some of the smoky noir touches they get turned up, and then we got the WhatsApp Shakespeare with the multi-part piano flourishes around an Eminem impression of Venom that later goes pure show tune. It's in the first third of this album, and the subtext just became text. You could have put that song in Juliet, it might have even worked for the plot. And once I had that framing in mind, This Music May Contain Hope not only made a certain amount of sense to me, its strongest moments began to unlock. Her patter, her genre bending, her grand ballads, the pure theater kid camp that I once called Riverdale core, which, as is a term I quoted, I would describe it as melodramatic, high-intensity pop music trying to balance a retro sheen with darker, mainstream gloss and thinks that it's way more edgy than it is. That all shifted from being a real weakness to being more of a strength. And truthfully, that's where RAYE hit strongest for me. Not just escapism as her breakthrough hit, but also the haunted girl power sequel, Clack Symphony, with Hans Zimmer of all people, less because of Zimmer's strings arrangement, I gotta be honest. I would argue that RAYE herself delivers a better arrangement on the following song, the trembling power ballad I Know You're Hurting, with this terrific well-placed key change, and also more because, well, RAYE's got a knack for subtly bending the melodic compositions while playing still within a lot of pop archetypes and song structures. Hell, what's probably her best song to date, Born Again, which she gave to Lisa Blackpink and she absolutely shouldn't have, it would have worked in context here on this album, where thematically, after facing heartbreak in high glam, given what you try to refocus on what matters. If death is inevitable, make life worth living with the people who are worth living with. But if I'm going to switch from music critic to theater critic here, if this was adapted for the stage, it might be a book that desperately needs multiple drafts to iron out the kinks. For one, this is an album that struggles tremendously with momentum, cohesion, and tone, most of which is accentuated by the sequencing that just loves a good ironic juxtaposition, but doesn't quite mask how often this album hits many of the same emotional beats over and over again to diminishing returns, and they're not all just callbacks. There's also no consistent pacing, as many a song runs long, as RAYE really tests my desire to see more songs have third verses and bridges to the absolute limit, and that's before she attempts to leap across pop, R&B, blues, jazz, soul, Afrobeats, gospel, and touches of modern hip-hop, all surrounded by the grand, sprawling trappings of musical theater, but also the occasional production choice that would not be easily recreated on stage and kind of just feels baffling. Now, some of this is the feeling that the songs have the arrangements to sound so grand and operatic and impressive, but the mix dynamics never quite sells them as impressively as they could, which is where I could not avoid that Broadway cast album comparison. It's relevant. But there are also some individual cases that threw me off completely. Winter Woman is a pretty impressive, smoky, modern marina song with some really pretty strings, but then it leads into a chipmunk vocal register halfway through the song, and why? Now, the genre bending's not uncommon, especially in modern musical theater, and it makes sense that RAYE might do it if she feels a broader cultural connection across genre, and it would fit if she's playing for the stage, but it leaves the perilous state of doing way too much without doing a lot of it that well, none of which is helped by the softer songs being completely outclassed by some competition, like what Olivia Dean released last year in The Art of Loving, with the most obvious example being the penultimate cut, Happier Times Ahead. It's an obvious and probably unfair comparison given similar vocal registers and how the industry has gotten really behind Olivia Dean in a way they never did for RAYE, but their vibes are different, and when there are parallels, they're not exactly favorable. RAYE wants all the effort up on display, and at full volume too, which can really run at cross purposes to letting some of the songs breathe on their own, show confidence in the material. And that's strange to feel when she's certainly giving the songs the space compositionally to sprawl, whereas Olivia Dean is confident enough to trust in her own material and writing, and then let the situations come more to her. A poise and tastefulness that would certainly endear her to the industry that RAYE certainly doesn't seem to possess, and the industry wasn't that endeared. We know the story. It's also compounded by two huge issues in the writing. The first being a frustrating lack of subtlety and dimensionality, of which, okay, I'm honestly kind of divided. Continuing my issue with My 21st Century Blues, RAYE's songwriting is often so broadly sketched, painting in a lot of hyper-stylized frames with a lot of detail, but her patter is so fidgety and overworked that it comes across in dire need of an editor, or at very least someone to ask, is that all you're trying to say here with all of those words? To continue the theater parallel, there's definitely some Lin-Manuel Miranda in her writing, where you can hear her voice in every song she writes, convinced of her stylism, but also desperate to impress. It was trying to simulate the arc of millennial women sick of the fuckboys and looking to find hope and love after loving too hard and getting heartbroken too many times, where the comeback story is starting to ring a little bit hollow as you've gone through it over and over again, and you're stuck overthinking it all. I can absolutely hear, I can buy the roots of that emotional resonance. And when this pattern could work, it makes sense for that internal monologue. But if you dig between the lines, I hear less overthinking or finding new well springs of depth, more recircling tropes and cliches as she cycles through sounds increasingly sloppily. It's just not making the most of your words on display. Your poetry could be a lot more efficient. And it comes out early too. I Will Overcome, it's not bad in setting the operatic frame right after the intro, establishing the themes, but the choice to focus on online drama around her career feels like an immediate misstep. Not saying it's not relevant, but it takes away from the central romantic heartbreak that is the quintessence of your album. Now, this can also work in melodrama, where you're functioning in that heightened state of reality where the colors are all the more vivid and the emotions, again, operatic, it's all pure camp, and that it shouldn't matter if it just consumes your entire lens. And when the album tries to commit to it, I buy in more often than not. But then there's the humor, or attempts thereof, and the near constant string of meta-commentary about what the songs are trying to convey, but also not really, it's all a show, and we're going to include the stage directions and a full ending credit song. I'm choosing not to think that's an Open Mike Eagle reference, but it reminded me of it. And it's also completely sincere, doubling down on the verisimilitude of the theater. And yet, as someone who's normally a sucker for this sort of meta-commentary, art about the process of making art, I did a whole video essay on it, this prompted more than a few eye rolls because the mechanisms of breaking the fourth wall and being meta, they function differently in theater than on record. The jokes with the audience in mind, they rarely make the soundtrack album, and for good reason. It just destroys some of that sense of immersion. One of the more glaring examples here is Goodbye Henry, that gets Al Green of all people, but a lot of the overwritten gestures at the song's construction feel cloyingly goofy. Just make the best of your music legend guest star. You nearly do just that on Nightingale Lane, the next song. I circle back to Anne Juliet, and indeed a lot of the modern Disney that seems to be constantly aware of their own tropes to then subvert them or at least comment upon them, where the writing and framing of the album seems to fall in very similar territory. And I find myself wondering, why I don't tend to react that well to it. Some of it circles the fine line that I've mentioned before in my Gen Z hyperpop video, quoting Laura Snapes' old review of Charlie XCX's Vroom Vroom. Few things are as wearying as pop culture that constantly congratulates you on how clever you are for getting it. And I think there's some truth there, especially when that time on screen, on stage, or on record, it's being used in order to wink at the audience rather than actually say something with it. I mean, it becomes the Family Guy cutaway reference gag. It's a trick that everybody knows at this point, and it's kind of been beaten into the ground. At its best, metatext has something to say about the process. It deepens the themes. It accentuates the humanity on display from the artist behind the curtain, provides an amplification of what's already in the text. But at its worst, it becomes the replacement for text in a postmodern string of in-jokes, references, and elements that are gesturing at the focal point, pathologically obsessed with their own cleverness without actually providing that deeper understanding, and it feels hollow. And sometimes the metatext just overtakes the text outright. To get back to musical theater, about 15 years ago, I saw the mostly off-Broadway production called Title of Show. It's all about the process of writing a Broadway musical and the frustrated creative tensions balanced out by a lot of the commercial obligations of putting on a show, told through the structure of a musical, and I wound up really disliking it. I'm sure plenty of working actors and producers, they really got a kick at it. Probably every director and writer did, and every gesture in their direction. But when the book and the songs of both the musical and the musical within the musical, they're not remotely memorable, it felt shockingly hollow. And even if that was the point, just wasn't a very good show. It's even more frustrating when you're using the metatext as deliberate deconstruction, or at least attempting to, only for the text to then swing around and reinforce what you're trying to deconstruct. We're calling out the nature or issues with this thing that might be on display, but then we swing around to reinforce that thing anyway, which can leave you just really frustrated if you apply any degree of thought to it with that conclusion. You want to critique power, but you won't actually seriously take the risk to challenge it in your narrative. So you wind up further compromising your own story by ruminating more on metatext than creating the depth in the story by playing it straight. This was a problem in Juliet, which ultimately winds up way more normative in its conclusion than you might expect. It feels safely focus tested in a way that a lot of modern Disney does, willing to point out problems and tropes but petrified to actually write with some new ones or hold themselves accountable. RAYE has some of the same issues here, but I'll admit it does feel a little bit more excusable. Metatextual overthinking and panic when you can't reach new depth as you circle your emotions, that's a credible response in melodrama, but I prefer once you're done spinning your wheels, you try and do something with it. It's very telling that the big hit from the album in Where Is My Husband, it centers how love will ultimately find you, not the other way around. And yeah, you have to make sure you're secure and you're ready for love inside, but I don't hear a lot of the introspection to have actually done the hard work of healing along the way, and across the arc of the album, RAYE sounds like she needs it. To quote one of my most infamous reviews, in a comparison that was not made by me to this album, but it's hard to overlook, and I did see online, you don't want to provide excuses and justification for not making any choice. Might be a relatable response, but not one I'm remotely inclined to revisit. What's widely been considered the worst part of the album is I Hate the Way I Look Today. It's an outright show tune, and the warring impulses between self-loathing and self-love that fucking season 2 of Euphoria commented better upon it 4 years ago. I appreciate the tonal juxtaposition coming right after Lifeboat and its extended charity drive single vibe. A lucrative lane for RAYE, especially in the UK, but the last possible place I would want her to go, but it doesn't make the song any less excruciating. I don't want to go back to it, but all this wouldn't be as exasperating if it wasn't for the execution, which feels very built for the stage but lands so awkwardly on record. Why keep drawing attention to the artifice of the album's creation, where in the final moments of the project you swerve away from thanking the audience to the distributors, who you almost forgot were there, for the music that contains hope? Who are you trying to convince, the audience or yourself? Is it more about bad breakups with skeevy London boys as you crash out again and again, than try to reinvent yourself with all high glam and style? Or is all that performance too? The more you keep commenting on the trappings of all of it, the more the unreality of the experience manifests. Where if you do not go for absolute broke, you can't deflect with a lot of the old razzle-dazzle that you might be able to get away with on stage. And credit to her, the best moments of this project, they certainly try. Sometimes they stick the landing, but even if she had it, I'm not sure I would be fully pulled in. And I get why many a music critic wouldn't be as well, especially if they hear a lot of the hyper-stylism and not a lot of unique substance behind it, especially if we've heard a lot of pop music. Keep in mind, I'm doing the work to contextualize the stage, the meta elements where parts of it could be excused. I'm trying to take this more seriously. Whereas there are critics who will say, this sounds like modern Broadway in a cast recording, where if it works on stage, it sure as hell does not hold up to a re-listen of it. To quote Pitchfork, a thrilling show, but I wouldn't sit through them again. And for what? If all RAYE is ultimately doing is repainting that millennial self-esteem anthem arc, but with more cloying winks at the audience to ensure they get it. Given how hard she worked to break away from the major label structures, it's painfully ironic that her stylism would never work in that system, but her writing and themes feel market-tested to land that target demographic and play a lot of that same poptimism game. It's very familiar. And the irony gets crueler because the majority of smaller or independent theater that actually tries to take risks, they do not have the distribution or marketing to see a proper breakthrough in the way that music can, especially in the modern era. Live theater still needs a venue and a cast. They need to fill seats, where your overhead is just on a different level than your indie musician or even band, and you're fighting for a smaller audience of people who are still into theater who would actually appreciate it. For as much as RAYE is embracing more of the theatrical tradition, where every time she tries to highlight the trappings of all of it, some of the audience, they're going to be wowed, but more often than not, we've probably heard some of it already. And by the nature of her medium, there's a freedom that most working on the stage first will not have, especially when they have to consider the mainstream audience if they want to eat. And I can't even really blame RAYE for this. Different mediums afford the artist different avenues. If you're independent, you're working with what you have. I will give her that. But it is kind of incongruous when her marketing and metatext want to sell for that smaller stage, but her execution screams Broadway, playing the same old games that she kind of disparages, proving that she's not so far removed after all. I'm not sure it's a good irony to note.
I can see you standing on the edge. Your legs step on the ledge of life's afflictions.
And this is where I wish I had a better answer. Previous video essays had a little bit more of a call to action, identifying some broad systemic faults, but for those making the art this time around, I'm not sure I do. RAYE's album's receiving mixed reviews, but it's her best performing to date. She has credible charting hits on her own now, especially in the UK. And not for nothing, if we're going off of Where Is My Husband, I Know You're Hurting, and Clack Symphony, they are some of the best songs off the album, at least to me. I think the metatext is kind of shoddy and frustrating, trying to convince the audience that the material is way smarter and more layered than it is, but the audience is buying it. In the same way those Disney live-action remakes deliver disgustingly huge box office returns. People like to be congratulated on being smart and genre-savvy in their entertainment, even if the story's just not that good. Look at how popular the Scream franchise is, or again, live-action Disney. And there's no guarantee that getting smarter or denser is going to be a choice that'll make you money. Prime example, just last weekend I went to see a production of Cyrano, a smaller play taking a very metatextual and postmodern approach to the old Cyrano de Bergerac, and yeah, I absolutely loved it. They swapped the gender of Cyrano to inject some queerness into a lot of the text. They openly called out a lot of the mechanisms and flaws of the old tragic comedy, while also acknowledging why that play had enough resonance to get reworked in the first place, with the dense wit and humor and romance of the original, while still finding a way to tell a fresh story with a really poignant ending. Very mid-century black and white romantic comedy vibes. And I get the feeling some of the critics who might have been looking for more lyrical depth or flavor out of RAYE, they'd probably like to see that if it's in their neighborhood. Side note, there's also a romantic musical drama movie adaptation of Cyrano. It's got Peter Dinklage in it, opposite Ben Mendelsohn, Calvin Harrison Jr., and Haley Bennett. It's awesome too, but it's also not for everybody. It's a play that assumes you can keep up with its pace and its wordplay and the moral ambiguity. And while I was kind of ready to gush about it as the lights came up, my partner overheard somebody saying behind us, well, it wasn't the worst play I have ever seen. And on some level, that kind of broke my heart a little bit, because I know that for that sort of theater, it's not for everyone, especially if you can't keep up with the dialogue or you're just looking to get entertained for the broad spectacle. And if the artist is on board for that, there's nothing wrong with that either. And then both music and theater. And I won't say I'm above it either. See, every year I've given Marianas Trench a spot on my year-end list, especially as they themselves have gotten more meta with every single album. RAYE should really work with Josh Ramsey at this point. It makes way too much sense, if only to punch up some of the strength arrangements or give some of these mixes more epic, concrete dynamics. But if I'm trying to look at the big picture here, my critical angst comes largely in asking the audience to try a little harder, go for a little bit more. Try to meet art where it is, be it theater or music or any other medium. If you're going to criticize RAYE for making melodramatic musical theater, explain why that's not a bad thing so much as her missteps in that genre and space. She's operating on a different set of rules. You should try to play by them. I mean, that requires a different, nuanced, critical frame. I think she's earned it. If we want to give her credit for bucking the system that screwed her over, the least we can do when contemplating the art is not playing into the system that would propagate such misunderstandings when the poptimism game rewards the industry winners. It doesn't mean saying that is good or unquestioning praise so much as nuance that is harder to clickbait. Because the only people who win that race to the very bottom are the cynical, the lazy, the disingenuous, be it the record label executives or the theater producers who would rather cut corners than sell the best possible version of their art, because they don't really expect the audience is going to ask for more. And look, I get why it's hard to ask when it feels like working uphill in psychologically draining times, especially when it seems like the response from the powers to be will be take away the art, strip it for parts, not let the show go on, or gouge you relentlessly if you want it. But at this point, they're going to do that anyway. We can be better than them. You get nothing if you wait for it. At the very least, if the music may provide some vestige of hope, I'd rather turn that possibility into actual reality, and I think it can. Call it, I don't know, defying gravity.